Tiny Tim was one of the most unforgettable music stars of his time, a man who turned a strange voice and an even stranger image into worldwide fame. But on the final night of his life, in front of a live audience, the same stage that had defined his existence became the place where his story came to a sudden and tragic end. That night was not a random moment. It was the result of years of decline, private struggles, financial collapse, and serious health conditions he simply refused to slow down for. When doctors strongly warned him that continuing to perform could cost him his life, he made a choice that would make his final moments far more disturbing than anyone in that room could have imagined. In the summer of 1968, a strange and unforgettable figure appeared on American television screens. He was over 6 feet tall, with long curly hair, a pale face, and a ukulele strapped to his chest. When he opened his mouth, a high, quivering falsetto came out, a voice that seemed to belong to another century entirely. He sang old songs about tulips and moonbeams, and millions of people could not look away. His name was Tiny Tim, and for a brief moment, he was one of the most famous entertainers in the world. But behind the ukulele and the awkward smile was a man who had spent decades struggling to be seen, a man whose personal life was far more turbulent than any of his fans ever knew. The man who would become Tiny Tim was born Herbert Boutros Cowrie on April 12, 1932, in Manhattan, New York City. His father, Boutros Cowrie, was a textile worker who had immigrated to America from Beirut, Lebanon. Herbert grew up in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, a place filled with immigrants and dreamers trying to build something from nothing. He attended George Washington High School, but his real education happened somewhere else entirely. When Herbert was just 5 years old, he received a gift that would change his life, a wind-up gramophone. Along with it came a record of a song called Beautiful Ohio, performed by a singer named Henry Burr. He played that record over and over, captivated by the way Burr's voice floated above the melody, soft and sweet and slightly sad. That sound got inside him and never left. By the age of 6, he was teaching himself to play the guitar, his small fingers struggling to reach the frets on an instrument built for someone much older. He spent countless hours at the New York Public Library, not reading novels or studying history, but digging through old phonograph records and sheet music from the early 1900s. He copied songs by hand, learning the words and melodies of an era that had long since passed. His influences were not the rock and roll singers of his own generation. He loved Rudy Vallee and Bing Crosby, performers who had defined a different kind of American music. During his teenage years, he discovered that he could sing in a falsetto, a high ethereal tone that sounded almost otherworldly. Most teenagers would have been embarrassed by such a voice, but he embraced it. It made him different, and Tim knew that being different was his only path forward. Years of rejection before the spotlight, the early years of his career, were brutal. He began performing in small clubs and sideshow venues in New York during the 1950s, places where audiences were not always kind. His falsetto voice drew laughter more often than applause. He was ridiculed and rejected. And he lived in poverty, moving from one cheap hotel to another, surviving on whatever money he could scrape together from gigs that paid almost nothing. By the early 1960s, he had found a home in Greenwich Village, the heart of the folk and countercultural music scene. The Village was a place for oddballs and outsiders, and Herbert fit right in. He built a small but loyal following among audiences who appreciated his devotion to forgotten songs. He performed under several stage names during this period, including Larry Love, the Singing Canary, and Sir Timothy Tims. Eventually, he settled on Tiny Tim, a name that was both ironic and affectionate. He was not tiny at all, but the contradiction was part of the joke, and he was in on it. Then came 1968. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a comedy sketch show that had taken over American television, invited him to perform. He sang Tiptoe Through the Tulips, a song written for a 1929 musical called Gold Diggers of Broadway. The song was nearly 40 years old, but Tiny Tim made it feel brand new. The single became a top 20 hit on the Billboard charts, and suddenly the man who had been laughed out of small clubs was a national sensation. He released albums under major labels and became a household name practically overnight. The painful decline. But the fame would not last. By the early 1970s, the world had started to move on. The audience that once found him charming began to see him as a joke. The television invitations stopped coming, and the man who had made millions of people smile found himself alone, struggling to pay for a hotel room, wondering where it all went wrong. After the success of his first two albums, God Bless Tiny Tim in 1968 and For All My Little Friends in 1969, his later records failed to find an audience. The public had grown tired of the ukulele, the falsetto, and the old-fashioned songs. What had once felt fresh and surprising now felt like a gimmick. Once that label stuck, it was almost impossible to remove. The variety shows that had once fought to book him no longer returned his calls. Record labels lost interest quickly. Reprise Records dropped him from its roster, and his attempts to release music on small, independent labels went nowhere. His efforts to be taken seriously as a music historian and archivist were laughed off by critics who could not see past the ukulele. They wanted him to sing Tiptoe Through the Tulips and then get off the stage. During his peak years, Tiny Tim had made a fortune from record sales, television appearances, and the famous wedding broadcast that millions of people watched. But he had no one to help him manage it. He spent extravagantly on hotels, clothes, and old memorabilia, buying the things that had been out of reach during his poverty-stricken youth. By the 1980s, his money was gone. He was living modestly, often depending on whatever he could earn from a small performance at a county fair or a nostalgic convention. Promoters and managers often underpaid him, knowing he had nowhere else to go. They exploited his strangeness for publicity, booking him for events that treated him as a freak rather than a performer. 3 marriages and a life full of heartbreak. While millions of Americans watched Tiny Tim strum his ukulele and sing in that high, sweet voice, they had no idea what was happening behind the closed doors of his private life. He was married 3 times, and each marriage brought its own kind of pain. His first marriage was the one the whole world saw. On December 17, 1969, Tiny Tim married Victoria Mae Budinger, known to fans as Miss Vicky, live on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The broadcast drew between 30 and 35 million viewers, making it one of the most watched television events of its era. Tiny Tim was 37 years old at the time, 20 years older than his bride. The couple had a daughter, Tulip Victoria, born in 1971, but the marriage was already beginning to crack. The age gap that had seemed quirky during the televised wedding became a real problem in daily life, and by the time their divorce was finalized in 1977, the relationship had been strained beyond repair. The custody battle over Tulip Victoria was particularly painful. Tiny Tim's unconventional persona and unstable income were used against him in court. Lawyers argued that a man who dressed in thrift store clothes and sang in a falsetto could not provide a stable home for a young girl. Tulip Victoria went to live with her mother, though Tiny Tim maintained contact with her whenever he could. The distance between them never fully closed. His second marriage, in 1984, to a woman named Jan Allweiss, lasted 11 years before ending in divorce in 1995. Money was always tight, and the constant pressure of living on the edge took its toll. By the time that marriage ended, Tiny Tim was emotionally and financially drained. His third marriage began in August of 1995, just over a year before his death. His new wife, Susan Marie Gardner, was a devoted fan who had followed his career and become his companion in his later years. She provided something that had been missing from his life for a long time: stability. She did not care about his faded fame or his empty pockets. She loved him for who he was, and she stayed with him until the very end. A body breaking down. By the mid-1990s, Tiny Tim was not the same man who had charmed millions of television viewers 25 years earlier. The long curls were thinner and streaked with gray. The face that had once seemed boyish and strange now looked worn and tired. He was only in his early 60s, but his body had aged far beyond its years. He was fighting a battle that no amount of showmanship could hide. For years he had lived with diabetes, a condition that required careful management of his diet and blood sugar. On top of that, He had congestive heart failure, which meant his heart was too weak to pump blood effectively through his body. He also suffered from chronic heart disease, which put constant strain on his entire cardiovascular system. These were not minor problems. They were life-threatening conditions that required rest and medical supervision. But Tiny Tim did not know how to rest. The first serious warning came on September 28, 1996. He was performing at the Ukulele Hall of Fame Expo in Massachusetts when something went wrong mid-song. His body went rigid, and he collapsed on stage in front of his audience. It was a heart attack. He was rushed to the Franklin County Medical Center in Greenfield, Massachusetts, where he spent nearly 3 weeks recovering. The doctors were clear with him. His heart was in bad shape, his diabetes complicated everything, and if he kept performing, he would not live much longer. They told him not to perform again, using plain language that left no room for misunderstanding. Tiny Tim listened to everything they said, and then he ignored it. The final night. On the last night of November 1996, Tiny Tim stepped onto a stage for the final time. The event was called an Evening Under the Stars, a benefit dinner hosted by the Women's Club of Minneapolis, Minnesota, organized with deep irony to support the American Heart Association. The room was filled with dinner tables and white tablecloths, and people who had come for a pleasant evening of nostalgia had no idea they were about to witness something that would be talked about for decades. Before the show, Tiny Tim appeared frail and disoriented. His legs were swollen, making it difficult to walk. He seemed confused, as if the world around him was moving faster than he could follow. Sue helped him get ready, adjusting his suit and straightening his collar, trying to conceal the physical decay that had become impossible to ignore. He looked like a ghost of the man who had once serenaded millions of viewers on The Tonight Show, but he was determined to perform. He sang Tiptoe Through the Tulips, the song that had made him famous nearly 30 years earlier. The high falsetto that had once seemed so strange and wonderful now sounded thin and fragile. He was not halfway through the song when his body gave out. He suffered a massive heart attack while singing the words the whole world knew. Some people in the audience thought it was part of his act. They laughed at first, assuming the collapse was a joke. But then they saw Sue rush to his side, and they realized this was not a performance. This was real.